In this clip, we're going to learn how to create, select, and view objects inside of 3ds Max. Alright, so if you want to follow along with the project files, go ahead and go to File, Open, and then it should bring you to this Scenes folder. In there, you're going to see 3ds-max-fundamentals-m1-04. That stands for Module 1, Lesson 4, and then you're going to look for _begin. So once you've done that, hit open. Now, if you don't see that, that means that you haven't set up your project folder. And what you would want to do is go back to the last lesson and go through that and set that up. All right, so now that we have this ready to go, let's talk about creating objects. To create an object in the scene, we'll go up to Create, Geometry, and we're going to use standard primitives. Now, I'm not going to go into all of these. I'm just going to show you how to create a couple, so that way we can learn how to select and view objects. So let's take a sphere, and I'm going to drag one in. We might even drag a couple. So I'm going to left click and drag another one. And let's go to teapot. Let's left click and drag that one. And you can try a couple of different shapes. Now the sphere and the teapot, these are one-click types of pieces of geometry during the creation process. You might have some other ones that take a little bit longer to create, like a box. With a box, you'll left click and drag out the base of that. You'll release, and then you're going to drag up the height, and then you'll left click and create that. And now that box is created. The same thing for a cylinder as a box. It takes 2 clicks to do that. So left click and drag out the base, release, drag up to get your height, and then left click to create the height of that. Now a tube takes 3 clicks to do. You're going to left click and drag out the base, and then you're going to drag to get that inner amount. You're going to left click, and then you're going to drag to get the height. So that took 3 clicks there. Now we have a bunch of different objects in our scene. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to right click, so that way we're no longer creating any tubes or any pieces of geometry. And you can see in the different views we have several pieces. So let's talk about selecting objects. To select an object in your view, all you have to do is simply left click and select that. Now you'll notice that in 3ds Max 2018 we have this highlight around the objects. The currently selected object is highlighted in blue. If you want to see a preview of what's going to be selected next, you'll see that in a yellow highlight. So there we go. Now, what if I want to select multiple objects? I want to actually select just the teapots themselves. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to come up here to my top view, and I'm going to left click on that top teapot there, and then I'm going to hold down Control to append a selection. And then I'm going to select that next teapot, and you'll notice now both of those are selected. Now, if I had come in and actually held down Control and then selected that sphere by accident, and I want to remove just the sphere from my selection, what I'll do is I'll hold down Alt and then left click on that, and that will remove a selection. So Control to append selections and Alt to remove selections. Now I also have the ability to use a region selection. Now region selections are pretty much like any other PC-based selection. If you left click and drag, you'll get this little marquee or this region, and you can select around what you want to select. So here I've gone ahead and selected everything in the scene. Now you can use that region selection with the Control key held down and append selections that way. So I'm going to just left click and drag and select these 4 objects, and then I'm going to hold down Control, left click and drag and get these 2 objects, leaving out that green sphere. So here's how you append that. Now if I want to remove, it's just the same as it was before. Hold down Alt and left click and drag, and let's just remove these 3 objects. So now you've seen how we can use the marquee selection or the region selection to append and remove. Now you also have the ability to select inside of the Scene Explorer. There are going to be many times where you have lots of objects, and it can be very difficult to get that one piece that you need inside of the view. So it might be easier to go to the list. So to select an object in the list, if you want to append, hold down Control and select Sphere 02. Now, it doesn't work the same way in the list as it does in the view itself. If I held down Alt and tried to click on Sphere 02, you'll notice it doesn't do anything. So I need to hold down Control in the Scene Explorer to append and to remove. Okay. Now, if I were to just select on Sphere 002, you'll notice that it still keeps my selection. But if I were to just select Teapot 001 without holding anything down, it'll deselect everything and only select that object. Okay, so very important. It's a little bit different in the Scene Explorer than it is in the scene. So now that we've talked about how to select objects and how to select them using region selection and all of that, there's one little toggle that I want to show you with the region selection that can affect the way that you select objects in your scene. So let's deselect by clicking outside of anything, just that empty space. And I'm going to come right up here to the top, and you can change the shape of your selection region. You can hold down and you can change it to a circle. You can change it to kind of a polygon type of selection where you just click points and select that way. Okay, so you can kind of create a selection like that. You could also have kind of a freehand selection. So if you just left click and hold, it's like a lasso. So if you want to select it like that. So anything that lasso touches will be selected. And that is defined by this toggle right here. This is the window crossing toggle. Whenever you have it turned on by default, this is crossing. So anything that our region touches will be selected. If I left click on that, this is now in window mode. And what this will do is anything that is completely encompassed by our selection region will be selected. So notice that I've gone through the bottom teapot and that cube at the bottom, but I didn't completely go around them. When I release this, it will only have these three objects selected because they were completely encompassed. Now, it's important to know that this does not just work with the lasso. It does work with any one of these region selections. So if I were to switch this back to the default rectangular selection region, and I left click and dragged around those three objects, cutting through that teapot and that cube again, you'll notice that it keeps that same selection. Let's go ahead and try it around with these 6 objects here, or 5, excuse me, and you see that we are only selecting those. So that can be very helpful whenever we're trying to make very accurate selections. So I'm going to go ahead and turn that back to crossing to its default value. So now that we've talked about selecting, let's talk about viewing objects. One thing that you've noticed in the viewport, especially in the top, front, and left viewport, is that we are in wireframe mode. We may want to view our objects other than wireframe. We may want to see that shaded view. All you have to do is simply go to the wireframe and left click on that, and then you can change it to whatever shading mode you want. So you can change it to a default shading, which is what we have here. You can change it to facets, which will give us that default shading, but with no smoothing on those polygons. We can change it to bounding box to where it's only the bounding box is showing, not necessarily the shapes. And then we could change it to flat color, which gives us no shading whatsoever. And we can just see the silhouettes of those objects. We have clay, which gives us this clay type of shader on top of the object. And then the final one, if I click on that, we have stylized. Now there are lots of different styles that we can choose from. We could switch this to graphite, to color pencil. It's important to know that this is just for viewing. It's not necessarily going to render out in this way. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to switch this back to wireframe override, so that way we're just seeing that. Let's select our perspective view, and I'm actually going to hit Alt-W so I can see what this looks like. Whenever I switch from my top, front, and left viewport, while in the perspective, it is keeping the view that we had in the top, front, and left. So you can see the front, we can have the left, and if we hit perspective again, hitting P on the keyboard, it does go back to that default shading. Now on the default shading, there is another one that's going to be really important for us, and that's edge faces. I typically work with this on because it shows me exactly how these pieces of geometry are made up. So I can see all of the polygons on each object. This is going to be very helpful during the modeling phase. Now, typically, whenever I'm working in this perspective view, I'm using a couple of keyboard shortcuts. I'm using F3 to switch to wireframe mode because this can be very helpful during selections. You hit F3 to go back to that shaded view, and then you can hit F4 to switch between default shading and the edge faces. So F3 to go to wireframe, F4 to show the default shading. Now, if I hit F4 while in this wireframe, you'll notice that it doesn't actually turn the default shading on. We have to hit F3 to go back to the default shading, and then F4 to switch to edge faces. So now that we've talked about selecting and viewing objects, let's talk about creating and transforming objects in our next video.